Here we go. Welcome to another Wabash Center webinar. It is a good day for a vital conversation. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. At the producer's desk is Carly Hollinsby, and Paul Myrie is our sound engineer. Today, our topic is personal agency needed for anti-racist work. During the show, questions for our guests are to be emailed to Paul Myrie. Paul's email is myhrep@wabash.edu. That's myhrep@wabash.edu. This conversation is the third in a series of 7 conversations with Melanie Harris and Jennifer Harvey. Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris is Associate Dean of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion of Adran College and the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, as well as Professor of Religion and Ethics with Texas Christian University. Dean Harris is a well-known facilitator of conversations to heal the wounds of racism and has been part of the leadership of the Wabash community for quite some time. Our other guest is Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey. Dr. Harvey is Professor of Religion at Drake University, where she also serves as Faculty Director for the Cru Scholars Program. Dr. Harvey's books on racism include Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in Racially Unjust America. It is a New York Times bestseller. And her book entitled Dear White Christians, for Those Still Longing for Racial Reconciliation. Dean Melanie Harris and Dr. Jennifer Harvey regularly offer anti-racist seminars and workshops in institutions across the country, as well as for the Wabash Center. Thank you both for your leadership. Thank you both for your scholarship and your commitment to this death-dealing work. Welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks
Westfield.
so much for having us.
Let's start our conversation. And it feels like an ongoing conversation, right? Since this is the third of 7 that we're doing. Specifically discussing the nature of racism, right? To help further, deeper understand what we're up against in doing anti-racist work. So let's problematize more racism. And start by saying, and I want you both to speak to this question. So Melanie, go first. But the question is, what does it mean that white America has such a high capacity to tolerate racism, to overlook racist acts, and to look past racist behavior?
Thanks. It's a deep question. It really is. And it is one I think that every white American ought to ask themselves about how they actually have learned about racism and if they actually see it. I think that the biggest moment for most white Americans, of course, in the past several months was the death and murder of George Floyd. And actually seeing a white police officer abuse his authority and literally have his knee on the neck of an African-American unarmed man, I think was probably the first time where that kind of violence had to be ingested by so many white Americans. And I do think that there probably was a kind of moment of resistance, internal kind of resistance in actually seeing it, and then in many cases having to see it over and over and over again. That internal resistance, unfortunately, is very normative, but I think a lot of white Americans don't know how to name it, which is that some of this in their, I think in their kind of psyche is acceptable, because there have always been images of white men over or violating the bodies of Black people, Black men and Black women and Black children. And I think in most white American kind of psyches, this has become normal, completely normal, and in many cases historical. And so there's a very quick, I think, move from recognizing the normality or naming or experiencing the normality of it to then assuming that it's right. That the police officer must be right. And it's not so much the police officer, but also the person in white skin must be white. And there's a kind of identity that one might, identification that one might have with the white skinned person, because the human, generally the way that we want to walk through the world is to assume that we are right. And so I think that there's a quick move from most white Americans that if they don't slow down to ingest the depth of the violence and to ingest that act as a racist act, the violence as a racist act, then if they don't slow down, it's very easy just to swallow racial violence as a part of the way that it is, and the assumption that white people are always white. And of course, that's a white supremacist principle, right? And frame. I think it's difficult then for white Americans to learn how to slow down. And upon being able to slow down, I think that's the first moment of recognition that something is very wrong.
So Jen, the Bull Connor, the televised moments in history were Bull Connor in the '60s and the dogs and the hoses that were on television. One of the first highly promoted moments on television. I'm following Melanie's train of thought. That was a moment when people saw these violences against African American people, against Black bodies, and became enraged as a nation, or at least curious as a nation, to say, this is wrong, or at least, is this wrong? Is there something wrong with this? So fast forward, as Melanie did, also then to George Floyd for that public execution by the police officer. Another moment when the country then was challenged to say, is this wrong, right? What kind of violence is this, and is this wrong? That moment seems like it has moved quickly away.
Yeah.
There was something happened in that moment, but it didn't last long. We got some traction, but the traction didn't last long.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's more than two, but I think there's at least two things that are going on that immediately come to mind when I hear the question. And in a way, I think the way you phrase the question, the high capacity of tolerance for racism is like the $1 million sort of insight, because when I think about what happens with white supremacy and white people, it's like I don't know the chemical, but you can build up a tolerance for poison, right?
Sure.
But if you ingest a little bit of it at a time, certain kinds of poison, pretty soon your body can process poison. Doesn't mean you're not poisoned, but you can live.
And that's what of a vaccine, right? That's the same principle as of a vaccine.
Yes. Or I'm thinking of the scene in Princess Bride where he wins the standoff with the guy because they both drink poison. Turns out he's developed an immunity to poison. Mm-hmm. And that's what white supremacy does to white people. And because we start ingesting it the moment we take in air upon birth. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, that's a piece of what's going on, is our tolerance is incredibly high because it's literally become part of our bodies, however long we've been on this earth, and actually passed down through generations. And so unless and until we engage in daily intentional practices around unlearning, disrupting, not just sort of at an intellectual level, but in our day-to-day life level, our body just continues to develop, become tolerant. And so I think when we think about this summer in Minneapolis and the murder of George Floyd, and I think for many, many white people taking in that image, there is actually for many of us an immediate like, oh my gosh, this is horrifying and wrong. And oh my gosh, recognition of being connected to a system that allows this kind of anti-Black violence to repeat over and over. But, and so we might galvanize in a moment, mm-hmm. because we're horrified by that, but we don't always connect that sort of our daily then ongoing ingesting of poison disables our ongoing commitment to challenging, finding it intolerable to be in a classroom, to be in an academic setting, to be in a faculty meeting where racism is happening. If we don't find that intolerable, it becomes very sort of, well, do I feel like challenging it today or not? Kind of intellectual for us. And I think that that's at least some of what goes on, is it's literally become part of our bodies until we decide to repeatedly purge ourselves of that toxic poison of white supremacy, because it's literally part of what it means to be racialized as white in this nation state.
So I think that both of your statements are both insightful and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah.
That those folks who are about this work and committed to this work, who have moved beyond their own personal blaming and shaming, right? Get over the blaming and shaming and get to the work. Right? Don't make yourself the work. When we move to that next step, we're not going to blame or shame. We're going to say that this is so pervasive. So um, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who has written a lot about racism and anti-racist work, who says that racism is so pervasive as to be like smog in the air. That's precisely, Jen, what you're talking about. That we breathe it in. It is a part of how we move in our society, in the United States, in American society. That being said, smog in the air can still be seen, or the particulates can be extracted, right? So what does it mean? And I'm going to go back to Melanie first and then come to Jen with these same questions. What does it mean, or what does it take then to be able to identify acts of racism, and not just as petty behaviors? Or very few people are running around saying bigoted things in our faculties. Not impossible to hear, but rare. It's usually more subtle than that. What does it take to be able to attune our ear, our sensibilities, our sensitivities to seeing those gestures, those particulates of smog in our faculties and in our institutions?
It's a really important question. And I'm glad we're in this kind of conversation because I think it is an interracial conversation. I can certainly speak to this as an African-American faculty person, but I can only speak in terms of guessing what it might be and what I've observed with my white colleagues. I think the truth is that everyone is kind of suffocated in this air, in this smog, and the smog is white supremacist culture in the academy, but it's everywhere. It's everywhere. But we have a particular way, I think, of wearing it and breathing it in the academy. So recently I've been coming into a new awareness of characteristics. And Tikam Okun, I think, is the author of a piece called White Supremacy Culture, whereby there are particular characteristics such as perfectionism, imbalance of deep reliance on the word versus the articulation, oral kind of understanding. This deep reliance on written epistemologies rather than oral epistemologies. And all of these different ways that we have approached the study of religion can also be characteristics of a kind of white supremacist culture. It's literally an approach that we've all taken. There's something I think too significant that both Jen and I are yoga practitioners, right? That there is a sense in which I think that many white faculty that I have seen, when they have become or dedicated themselves to an anti-racist way of being, they actually slow down their own breath. Right? So they actually slow down their own breath and body to begin to get in tune with this practice of checking the self, right? Practice of actually checking the space, signaling, seeing the atmosphere. And what I mean by that is in a faculty meeting, for example, getting a sense of everyone's bodily position and reading body language. Actually noting the fact that we have, for example, in many faculties, many different languages and many different accents around the table. And then taking the time as a white faculty person to, and I know I do this myself as a faculty person of color, I'm not a Spanish speaker. I wish that I was, but I'm not. But I have many colleagues that are Spanish speakers. Because I don't know Spanish, I've actually had to check myself and listen more deeply. So I actually have to take a breath, deeply interrogate any old stereotype that I may have running around in my mind around Spanish and hearing Spanish as a non-beautiful language, because it is a beautiful language. I have to check myself and remind myself, I'm the one who doesn't know the language. I'm the one who actually needs to take a deep step back and try to understand what is being said. And if there's a heavy accent, for example, I'm the one who actually needs to work harder to listen deeper. I think as a white faculty person, what I have observed in some anti-racist white faculty is that they actually take a moment and pause and check themselves and take a moment of humility and recognize the language, the tone, the expression, the anger, even that may be coming out of a faculty person of color, they have every right to express that. I'm the one who actually needs to take a step back and try to translate for what that means. So I think that those are some ways of actually getting into the conversation in terms of this recognition of the embodiment of white supremacy and how to begin to interrupt it in a faculty.
But I think that's very helpful. So mindfulness practices, plural, breathing practices, those practices of awareness, intentionality that are becoming more and more pervasive in our culture, lend itself to learning how to listen for and about issues of racism and anti-racism. That's very helpful. Jen, come on in the conversation, because when Melanie says her perspective as a person of color, or a person, I'm going to say it a little more specific than that, with the racist target on her back and on her body, is different than the kind of practices, or we will hear from you, that a white person needs to participate in. And even saying breath, I mean, Melanie mentioned white folks to slow their breath. I can imagine the slowing of breath for a white person, and what you're looking for is still, though, in that practice of breathing, a little different where a targeted body is looking for. So come on in the conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Dr. Harris pointing to contemplative practices that help, like, are key. And I also am thinking about, I've just been listening often to Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who's a Black Zen priest, talking about how, white practitioners can so easily appropriate even these practices without, and so sort of adjacent to what Dr. Harris is talking about, I think for me, if I think about my own journey, it is just critical that whatever intellectual or even sort of moral interrogation we're doing of racism and the meaning of it in our lives or our institutions as white people, we have to understand that if we are not involved and engaged in communities of practice that are predominantly people of color, Black people, Latino people, in some sphere of our life, and segregation, of course, in our lives, for many of us who are white, makes this difficult. It's never something that happens naturally. We have to choose it. We have to choose desegregation. And it might not even be at our institution where we can choose it. But intellectual and moral frameworks, suddenly the sort of learning a new language and culture and embodiment that I hear when I hear Dr. Harris talking about what you can learn to become attuned to, it happens when you're in spaces where peoples who live an everyday kind of existence that's much richer, broader, deeper, more alive than the death culture of white supremacy are living it. You can actually, I don't mean this in an appropriative way, but you can kind of learn, your body becomes different when you spend time in those spaces in a sustained way. So now when I walk back into my all white space X, right? I've learned a new language, my ears hear differently, and I go, ooh, that wouldn't fly over here, and it's no longer going to be tolerable to me either. And that doesn't mean I've suddenly, I'm over identifying as if I'm a person of color. I'm not, but white people can develop these capacities that we don't develop in white only spaces, even if our intellectual analysis is first rate. So we have to, it's got to be some kind of embodied practices and commitment in our lives in other spaces.
So Jen, keep going. What is it to be complicit, for a white person to be complicit with racism? Help us understand that.
Well, in some ways,
because we don't want to be complicit.
Of course
they
not.
don't want to be complicit.
Of course
but
not.
Then
so
we discover we are, and that's part of what you're talking about in your description.
I mean, so in some ways, let me just unveil the mystery. We're all complicit all the time, period. Because it's drenching, it's everywhere. And as much as I could point to the many ways in my own journey, I'm engaged in explicit anti-racist habits, practices, relation, blah, blah, blah. I'm complicit too. So we have to give up that mythology. That's not the same thing than saying, I'm going to agree. Oh, so too bad. I just have to go with the flow, right? What it means to be complicit is to be in those spaces that remain predominantly white and think, oh, well, this isn't my field. It's not diversity is not my field. And so I really am glad the sociologist or the ethicist over there is going to work on this, but thank goodness they're here, but this isn't really my field. No, this is not, racism and white supremacy isn't in a field, it's in all the fields, right? So complicity can look like that. It can look like, well, I don't know these things and it's really scary, and I live in a really white part of the state, and then sort of not taking the next step and thinking, oh, when did this part of the state become white? What did that look like? You know, I mean, there is no sort of naturally white space in the United States of America, right? And so, or saying, well, because I'm in mostly white space and I can't learn these things that I hear these three scholars talking about right now, and I'm going to say, no, there's people convening all over the time, all over the place, all the time. Any of us can access spaces if we behave appropriately, where we're welcome and invited to be engaged in contexts where people of color are leading and organizing, and we will change if we commit to showing up in those spaces. Complicity means thinking that's not an option because I'm too busy. We're, you know, and you know, again, it's got to be, if it's not a choice, if it's not chosen as a priority, none of this happens naturally for white folks. And so failing to choose is also a form of complicity, because it's not going to happen by itself.
Passivity is a form of complicity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. These systems will just keep doing their thing until enough of us join scholars of color who are actively every day doing it and saying, no more, no more, no more.
So, excuse me, one more question before we get into the the specifics of personal agency, right? But we're laying out kind of this tapestry or this landscape of, when we talk about racism, what is the nature of racism? So Dean Harris, there's this term that floats around, that has been floating around, called microaggressions. I have a problem with the term because I don't think any of these aggressions are micro. But tell us about microaggressions, because the term is so widely used. And again, help us get inside of what in the world is a microaggression, and how does it function? How does it live? How does it embody itself?
Well, microaggression is essentially a subtle way of denying someone or discriminating against someone. It can be seen in actual acts, like in a faculty meeting, but it can also be seen in these kind of meta ways that we see in tenure and promotion policies, for example, or policies that discriminate against women and women of color, particularly in particular ways. Oftentimes, a microaggression is ingested by a person of color in a faculty meeting and then processed later. That is to say, that when it actually happens, often a person of color is trained to be able to take the hit and then to process that hit and the pain of that hit after the faculty meeting, often not in conversation with the faculty colleagues themselves. That eventually can not only reduce one's sense of belonging with the faculty, but it can also be very demoralizing and eat at a person of color's, or certainly a faculty person's color's, confidence. So the question I know in my experience as a faculty person, when they've happened, and I've kind of watched microaggressions kind of thrown around the table, some were directed at me as a person of color, but oftentimes microaggressions just are kind of flying around the room, and there are lots of different forms of aggression that often happen in a faculty meeting. And it depends on the culture, right, of the faculty. There are some faculty that genuinely are colleagues. They actually really do get together. They really do genuinely want the best for each other. They want the sharpest intellectual conversation partners among each other. And they genuinely care about and love each other. This is very rare in theological education, and it's very rare in higher education, in part because of the kind of frame of white supremacy that is in everything and certainly impacts our academy. But there are most faculties who don't get along at all with each other. And oftentimes what happens in a faculty is that the person of color, often once they become more senior, is isolated to the point where there is just an assumption that that person no longer is a part of the community. They're always thinking in their own way. They're always doing their own thing. And so an assumption that oftentimes white faculty make, even as a form of aggression, is to find ways to leave them out or push them out. And so this is oftentimes what we see when faculty of color become so frustrated with their faculty and their institutional experience that they leave. And this is not uncommon. This is one of the reasons why retention is such an important thing to be paying attention to in the work of inclusive excellence and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So microaggressions can take a number of different ways, but I've experienced them from white women faculty in a different way in the bathroom, for example. And it can become quite petty. Who gets to use the sink to wash their hands first? And is there some kind of politics of respectability based on whiteness and white women's privilege that I'm supposed to wait to wash my hands for the white woman colleagues there? So it can be that, and it can also be this way of actually webbing a faculty life together that is exclusive, that it literally intentionally leaves out all faculty persons of color.
So that's why I mean that the labeling of them is micro, using the term micro. There's nothing micro about it. I had the privilege of working with Bill Coffin many years ago, who was a well-known activist across the country. And he used to talk about death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? So, and his point was, whether you die by, a cutting of the throat or 1,000 paper cuts, you're still dead, was his literal point. So I have experienced microaggressions, seen them, witnessed them a great deal through multiple silences. So who is the person who is ignored even when the person speaks at the table, the faculty person who speaks, the elder African-American male scholar who speaks and is ignored? So then the white folks say, well, we're not racist because we didn't say anything against him, but you ignored him. The hostility of being ignored is an aggression, is a racist aggression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another form of that is when a person of color does speak, they share an amazing idea, they share an amazing proposal, and literally in the next voice, and the person who speaks next as a white person re-articulates that same idea and claims ownership.
And then the conversation ensues only when the white person says this marvelous idea.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. I've witnessed that a lot. And I think what it can do is silence the person of color. Like either they get, fed up and angry and they say, I'm just not going to share any more of my brilliance with this particular group because they can't actually see me and value my ideas in the way that they value their own. Or the person can actually use a creative silence. And this is going into a different wave of this kind of conversation. But silence can also be used by a faculty of color as an armor and as a shield, literally, to protect oneself. And it can be, it's tricky. It's tricky.
Silence and withdraw, right? Silence.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Many faculty of color, I know in my own experience pre-tenure, I had to learn how to use silence, one, to protect me because my microaggressions were so intense. And they were quite macro, as you're saying, Lynn. But I also had to be careful not to fall into the silence so deeply that I felt myself becoming victimized by the oppression that was all around me. So it's a different conversation around silence, but I do think that that's actually one of the things that can come out of or be a response to the microaggressions.
Go ahead, please. Yes,
I guess I want to sort of then connect this really powerful, just like bearing witness to the kinds of things that happen, then back with the earlier question on what complicity looks like. Because as I'm hearing you all speak, I'm thinking, okay, and especially for, white listeners on this call and for myself, here's what a commitment to unlearning complicity looks like. Is learning the embodied strategies as a white person to not just not do microaggressions. That's like the lowest bar, right? It's to actually learn how to use your body, your mind, your words to interrupt microaggressions when they're happening in real time. And that is a skill very few of us have developed and cultivated that takes time to learn and develop, but we actually can do, right? So what does it mean to be a white person in that around that same table, right? Where a scholar who's African-American has just articulated a brilliant idea there was silence, someone else is taking credit. And to like, so what do you do in that moment? You obviously it's too awkward to say like, excuse me, Dr. So-and-so, didn't you know, that something you have to learn sort of the art of not putting someone on the spot and exposing someone to further racist harm because you like do this paternalistic thing. And at the same time, making very clear, oh no, this isn't going to happen here. I'm going to interrupt in some way, almost literally using my whiteness as a sort of wedge to kind of at least create a little bit of space. And maybe it's even just a little bit of eye contact. Like, I see you, I saw just what just happened. You know, I feel like I heard something like that a few minutes ago. Is that what you meant, Dr. So-and-so? You know, but again, this is something that has to be learned, but not learning it becomes a form of complicity. Because later we might go, if we don't intervene, later we might go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to that poor colleague of mine at the meeting that I just was at and allowed to go on unchecked, right? So that's what, you know, this all plugs right into what refusal of complicity has to come to mean.
Or the infuriating thing of not saying anything at the table, and then after the meeting saying, oh, I heard them disrespect you, but I didn't say anything.
Yes, so sorry, Dr. Westfield.
Now,
That's right.
What am I supposed to do with this now other than be really mad at you?
Yeah, you're in that moment, I'm asking you to absolve me.
That's right.
Oh, I felt bad that happened to you. I'm the good white one that understood what was going on for you.
So then I have to survive the microaggression, and then I have to absolve the disrespect and sinfulness. That's a bit overstated, the sinful part, but absolve the person, play the priest for the person who did not come. And it's not about rescue as much as it's about fairness and justice. We are not asking to be rescued. We're simply asked to have our voices acknowledged and our presence seen. We are not invisible at these tables unless we become invisible at these tables.
And I think a lot of white faculty really do assume that the process and the path towards tenure will be the invisibilization of that scholar of color, that in order to get tenure, they will become invisible or find ways to invisibilize themselves in order to let the power of white supremacy kind of reign them and be embodied by white faculty colleagues.
Many faculty of color, African-American faculty specifically, play with the notion of erasure, to be E-R-A-C-E-D, to be erased. So the more as scholars we claim our race, we claim our cultures, we claim our languages, the more whiteness erases us. That's the height of unchecked white supremacy, to have to guard against that in our work and in our scholarship.
It is, and I think it's pretty difficult, I think, in a lot of faculties. I know in my experience of being on a faculty where there are white scholars who do scholarship on Africa, for example, and there are white scholars who do scholarship on the civil rights movement, or there are white scholars, and they do it in a way that is not anti-racist, right? So they don't actually approach it in this kind of Katie Cannon way of approaching it as a white scholar, naming their own social location as a part of their research kind of focus and lens. But they actually do it in oftentimes an exploitive colonialist way and get a lot of credit for it. But then in conversation with other faculty of color who do identify with the communities of color that they come from, who are explicit about their own social location and it's the subjectivity that brings to their own research eye, there is usually a tug of war, and we see this often in faculties which are very territorial, whereby only the true Africanist scholar can be seen as the white person, actually, who approaches Africa from a different approach that doesn't necessitate any kind of awareness about white identity, any kind of awareness about white privilege, but because they have been able to craft their work in particular methods of religion, which are very much akin to a kind of colonial mindset, Orientalism kind of way of thinking. They are the ones who are considered the top scholar, and that the scholar of color then is in this chaos of trying to recognize, okay, where does my voice fit in this discipline, in this conversation? So in that case, I think you're right. The erasure shows up in a lot of different complex ways.
So, Jen, one of the fallacies of that's perpetuated by racism is that whiteness has no culture, that is so normative and so pervasive and so universal. White people will actually report, I don't have a culture, I'm just normal. So when we talk about racism, and that one of the foils of racism is everyone bring who they are, bring your people, bring your community, the welcome table kind of metaphor. And white people literally say, I don't have a culture. I just don't know what it is. I used to not believe them. And after years of doing this work, I now believe that there is not, just like there's no awareness of racism, there's no awareness of white cultures and how they function. So when the erasure starts happening, that too is a lack of awareness.
Yeah, I mean, this absolutely for me goes back to the very first question you asked us about where does this high tolerance for racism come from? And for me, the sort of like, literally it's in our bodies because we are in these systems and we've breathed in this air and we've fed it to our children and we've had it fed to us. Because, you know, in some ways, I think this white people as quote unquote normal, even as we've in more sectors of the academy, at least intellectually, we're not sort of there at all in an embodied way, but have gone, okay, no, actually diversity matters. Okay, the welcome table matters, right? Even as we've done that, even those frameworks have still set us up for a certain kind of failure, because if I'm not normal, if that starts to get called into question because I'm now talking about diversity, then the next question is, well, then what am I? And pretty soon I'm just this, well, oh, thank God I'm a lesbian because I can bring that to the welcome table, you know, but what do I do if I'm straight, you know? And, you know, you know, because it's not going to be the race part for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly what it needs to be. But the problem is, and this is, you know, scholars and activists love to sort of argue about it, but I think the argument reveals the profound crisis, which is that white culture in US America is the outcome of different European identities having agreed to assimilate to whiteness in order to reap the benefits of white supremacy. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
That's what my
Absolutely.
ancestors did. So what do I bring to the table? Well, until I'm cultivating some sort of anti-racist anti-white, I mean, we don't even have it because you don't just make these things up with your mind. Cultures get built, and we haven't built ours yet. Right? So right now it's just a double negative if it's anything. And that's a profound crisis for racialized as white Euro-descended people in America that kicks back on Black and brown communities, because then we either I'm normal or I'm going to run around trying to appropriate your culture, right? Or I'm going to just sit here and feel jealous, right? And those are all versions of the same crisis. And it's a crisis we're not going to think our way out of. We're only going to grow our way out of.
So if white people need to grieve over what was lost during assimilation, so this is a rhetorical question. What would those rituals in white churches look like? To grieve what was surrendered, given up through assimilation, and was replaced then by white supremacy, all the goodies of white supremacy. So white supremacy is not to be trifled with. So you get a whole lot from joining the white supremacy group. But how do you see that? How do you see, at least consider that I still, even with all the goodies I get, might have surrendered more than what I get in return?
Yeah, it's a helpful rhetorical question. Thank you, Dr. Westfield, for laying it out there. I have seen not an articulated response to it, but I've seen lives of white scholars lived in the confusion of how to answer the question. What can often happen kind of post tenure, and what I've observed with many white colleagues, particularly those who are a mixed race, so to speak, but they have mostly passed as white scholars and white people in this United States, that they finally come into this kind of moment of recognition that if I were to acknowledge the part of myself that actually comes from a community of color, and that part of the bloodstream within me that is not white, I would have had to oriented myself completely different.
Completely differently.
Yeah.
And so then there becomes this choice, right? Do I change my scholarship? Do I change my approach? Do I need to now invest in different relationships with people of color? And how do I do that as someone who's passed as white all these years? And that's a different kind of whiteness journey, and a different kind of anti-racist whiteness journey. And because it may in fact feel, and I think it does, that literally one is shedding a part of themselves. Now, in terms of rituals, and this is where the appropriation that you mentioned, Dr. Harvey, is so important. It's very easy then to just leap into any kind of Native American kind of ritual, except for example, and suddenly I'm going to smudge. I'm into smudging. And suddenly I become a Native American spiritualities as a white person, not creating any kind of space for actual Indigenous scholarship and scholars. And I think that's one of the things that we also have to be particularly mindful about, particularly in this moment where institutions are investing, even in the pandemic, investing more deeply into conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion. Suddenly in some institutions, there is a move of all scholars, regardless of white scholars or scholars of color, to try to create more spaces for at least communities of color, or that look like they may be inviting. But in fact, are white scholars who have not yet done their work. And some scholars have passed as white who also haven't done their work, literally stealing from Indigenous worlds and peoples and cultures and their rituals. Absolutely. And then naming themselves as true anti-racist. So not even aware the fact that there are so many kind of institutional ways that they can disrupt the space by being actually honest and true.
So who is the self that teaches, which is one of the primary and perennial questions that the work of the Wabash Center asks, is critical then in this moment in this conversation. Who you are, who your body is, what self you bring into the classroom as a raced or not raced person, or universally raced, or how, and that is performed for your students in the context of teaching, has absolute importance in how do we create a future for our students and for ourselves.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There's a piece around this grief point, and I think this actually also pertains to our relationship with students and who we are as teachers, that is like profound and complicated, because we've got this really pronounced discourse going on right now about white tears, white fragility, white women crying, all this ways that white women's tears get weaponized, right? All things to be hyper vigilant about, and is kind of, we all, lots of us here have heard like what happens when white women start crying, right? But so sometimes we might then hear this grief thing that you've lifted up, Dr. Westfield, and go, oh, but wait a second, I'm not supposed to have grief. This isn't about me. I'm supposed to be tough and not cry about this, so what do you mean grief? And what would a ritual of grief and lament look like in white communities? And I think this is something that's been underdeveloped yet to this point, and is critically important, because when I hear that, I think, yeah, grief and lament, because yes, white supremacy has given us all kinds of goods. Let's not underplay that. Definitely. nonetheless, it's a death dealing deal. It's a death
Absolutely
dealing
is.
culture, right?
It absolutely is.
And so just what my ancestors gave up is just the tip of the iceberg, right? What does it mean? And this is, Resma Manikem talks about this. What does it mean to have been complicit with the deaths of our fellow human beings, right? To have inherited that legacy. And so for me, thinking about grief and lament, what shows up is also then not just sort of inventing a white culture out of the air or a ritual that sort of reclaims whatever my Euro heritage might be, but is, oh, where did my heritage get lost? It got lost when my ancestral legacy obliterated it relative to African peoples, indigenous peoples, right? And so grief and lament goes hand in hand with repair and redress, right? So I think about, how do I show up in the classroom? Being grounded and rooted in a deep sense of lament, which is different than guilt, right? It's different than guilt. A piece of authentic lament is about the ritual of insisting that where I live and work, I'm going to have my shoulder to the plow to create it as a place of belonging, true belonging for everyone, especially people of color in my institution, students of color, Black students, first generation African-American students, first generation Latino students, the communities in relationship with whom white supremacy required my assimilation in order for the goods of whiteness to come my way. Grief and lament about that, and that loss means redressing, repairing those relationships, which isn't just an individual proposition, it's a collective proposition. And that means structural repair where I live and work, alongside my groundedness in a sense of lament, but not despair.
But not despair, not blame, not shame.
That's right.
Forgiveness and in-depth, heart-filled work, because our future depends on all of us, not some of us.
Yeah.
Dr. Myrie, I know you thought I forgot about you. I didn't forget about you, nor the questions from our listeners.
Thank you. Very rich conversation, enjoying it a lot. There's a few questions that I think could be connected into this one set of comments and questions that one individual sent forward. The person says that she is a co-chair of her campus's relatively new Inclusion and Diversity Council. Her institution has not given the council a budget nor much authority, right? We could stop there and you could talk about that for an hour. Here's the question. How can we get buy-in from resistant staff and faculty to attending anti-racist trainings with no tie-in with tenure track requirements or other incentives? One would hope it would be the simple incentive improving your practices as educators with no what's in it for me attitude. But sadly, we always end up with the same few devoted co-conspirators in attendance, and none of the perpetrators of microaggressions and systems of oppression attend.
Thank you. I think that's a critically important question. So Melanie, please help us.
Yeah, there are lots of ways into this, so thanks for the question. I'm reminded of a few things. Charles Long's the African-American religious historian and had an extraordinary pedagogical life. But one of the things I think that he shared that may not be always helpful was that at some point in the community of learners, you've got to go with the folks who actually want to learn. And there is some wisdom in that, and being able to really kind of keep the momentum of, it sounds like, this diversity council moving forward. That is to say, to actually kind of take a moment to assess, of those who keep coming, who do want to do the work, what kind of institutional change can that group make? One, by becoming more anti-racist in their own paths and individual lives and lives as institutional citizens, but then also what kind of path might be laid out for them to do kind of personal transformation work. I think as a second point, that's one of the incentives, right? The question that can be laid out there is, do you want to become a better human? Not do you want to publish more scholarship, not do you want to be a part of a grant project, but do you want to become a better human? And I think oftentimes that at least catches people, especially in institutions where there's been any kind of climate survey around race taken, when it is apparent to everyone in the institution that the climate is unhealthy for the majority of students of color, the majority of faculty of color, the majority of staff of color. If that is just real and everybody knows that, then it seems to me that just asking people, do they want to be more human towards one another, is one way to get those who are resisting into the conversation. As the question actually indicates, oftentimes in institutions, if there is any kind of a feeling of monitoring or mandatedness to kind of anti-racist training, oftentimes there is resistance. And it's important to name that for those of us who are in this work, you're always going to face that kind of resistance.
Jen, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so one is that I've been put on those committees like that before. No resources, no authority. This experience might be different, but I would just encourage incredible willingness to look at this and say, if this is a setup and a waste of my time, this isn't the place to do it. Because the committees I've been on that have had no resources and no authority, we've spent more time and energy educating other committee members about why diversity isn't needing to worry that folks who support right-wing politics need to feel included on our campus. And so there was a point in my journey where I was like, okay, this is not a good use of my time and energy, because this isn't where transformation is going to happen. That may not be this case, but I want to just sort of invite the possibility that sometimes those committees we are more effective in other places. So a survey of that. A second thing is that the co-conspirators that are showing up for your programming value, connect, dive deep with those folks. And then the next step is to, even if it's, so you can't get other folks to come for now, okay, now then that same group of folks where you're growing deep roots, where and how are you then all starting to go embed yourselves in different decision-making bodies in the institution? So that, for example, next thing you know, some of those folks are on search committees and questions come up on the search around, oh, are you actually able to teach in an inclusive way in your classroom? If not, you're not a candidate for this job. So we need to pivot those co-conspiratorial spaces where I get it. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, we can't get the other people to come. Nope, who's here? And now what work can we galvanize with the folks that are here? And then the last thing I wanted to say is that this might sound pie in the sky, but we've been reading and talking about Adrienne Marie Brown and emergent strategy. I'm like, the other thing I think that we should be doing when we're deeply committed to this work is also realizing sometimes we need to make the spaces where transformation and liberation and connection are happening just like such a great party that folks start going, oh, wait, that looks more fun than what I'm doing. And so I'll give you an example. I used to do I still do these faculty mentor trainings for a program I direct with students of color, where we train mentors in some deep, hard growth work around racial identity development and this kind of thing. First couple of years, it was like, oh, who are the 10 people I can get to come to this? Because I need to get some mentors trained to work well with students of color here at Drake. Well, guess what? Now people are like, the waiting list is 20 miles long because those faculty have their experience has been so liberative for themselves in their classrooms that they're just like, you can see the glow, right? And students of color always want to take their classes because they've, and all of a sudden it's like, not all of a sudden, 8 years later, right? This is also long-term work. I sort of feel like the spaces where we're really doing inclusive excellence at Drake, people are a little bit like, ooh, it looks like there's some really, really good music and food over in there. Could I come in? And we're like, maybe. How committed are you ready to be? If you're ready to be committed, we'll walk with you, but you have to walk first with us before you get to come into the party. So I think we could flip the paradigm on its head if we get a little bit creative.
I just want part of what you articulated, Jen, are community organizing skills, basic community organizing skills.
Exactly.
And invitational skills that say, this is not broke down, beat up work. Come in and get your ass kicked work. That's not what we're advocating.
Right. If I can't dance, I won't want to be part of your revolution.
That the kind of work we're espousing is generative work.
Yes.
Where the long game is what's necessary. If they don't give you any money, find things to do that don't take much money, right? Or partner with people and committees that have money. or, right? So don't be stopped by an institution that does not welcome you with open arms, because institutions in and of themselves are programmed to be anti-racist spaces. So don't be surprised that they form a committee, want to tick the boxes, and then underfund the committee and underestimate the work, right? You know, in many regards, early on, it is subversive work. Even if it's on the organizational chart, it's still subversive work.
Yeah.
Is there another question, Paul?
Yeah, there were a number of questions around the aggressions, microaggressions, that kind of thing. And this one, I think you talked about it a little bit, but I think perhaps you could say more about suggestions for micro repairs or just repairs in general.
Can I offer a few?
Go
And you
ahead.
all can check me if
Yeah.
it's
yeah,
inadequate. Again, once you start to learn to see them, if you're white yourself and don't experience them, things like, you know, with our student, I think about it with students primarily first, because that's where I spend most of my work here. And like students of color go through their educational experience in predominantly white spaces where faculty don't know their names, don't pronounce their names correctly. And every time I see a student of color on this campus, I either greet them and use their name, or I introduce myself, apologize if we've met before and I haven't remembered their name, and make sure that names, right? Because microaggressions, and I could hear this earlier, we're actually talking about a failure to see people as human beings, which is why micro is the wrong word. They're every day, and that's why we call them that, but they're fundamentally dehumanized ways of seeing people. So names, a kind of acknowledgement of students with eye contact when they walk in class, which African-American students often never get from white faculty. Thinking about when you go into a meeting, who do you sit by? Because it's very predictable in predominantly white spaces. The small number of faculty of color will often be left without folks filling up the space, right? And so, like, and that might sound patronizing, but it's like, again, that interruptive movement when whiteness is just this like thick oppressive cloud in the air, and just saying, I'm going to do something different with my white body than what white bodies are going to do, and that I can predict are going to happen, right? So those are a few examples. Some of those they're not tiny, like names matter. Pronouncing them correctly matters. Making sure my colleagues can pronounce them correct. I correct my colleagues when I hear them mispronounce students' names. I don't sit and talk. I just say, hey, that's not actually their name, right? So that's just a few. I'm sure, Dr. Harris, you have others, but.
You know, I think that the repair, and actually Dr. Wu brought this language into the conversation around microaggressions, and I think it is repair, and I think setting it in the kind of reparations model is important. Educating ourselves on what reparations looks like and what it is in our particular institutional context. And that can mean everything from a kind of institutional turn to looking at the history of the institution and its, complicity with enslavement, African enslavement, or the history of white supremacy. That can be an act for an institution to actually begin to name spaces of healing and repair. I think as a faculty person, particularly in the faculty meeting, if you have faculty of color and you're trying to, as a white person, try to think through how to repair, it also means kind of giving yourself a chance to be a true colleague. If you are someone who is more senior and you've gone through tenure promotion, or you've gone through the ranks of actually having your teaching evaluated 1 or 2 years, it's an opportunity for you to actually be in deep conversation with a faculty person of color to ask them about the brilliance of their own pedagogy and what you as a white person can learn and listen from them. I didn't quite say that right, learn from them, but listen to them. And I think then bringing that conversation into faculty spaces when we talk about curriculum and who's teaching what workload, et cetera, that awareness, I think, can also be reparative. And it's, as you said, Jen, it's a way of actually seeing people. And I think it's often so strange to me, but it's often so important to say to white faculty, it is probably the case that your faculty of color, people who you work with, feel unseen.
Yes.
Yes.
And I don't care faculty and how long you yourself have been there, how long that person of color has been there, it is likely that they do not feel seen or heard. And that's important to state.
Ask the question, who belongs here and how is their belonging performed? So we can figure out who doesn't feel like they belong here, even though they are tenured, they are considered a senior scholar. And as people of color have never been welcomed or given a sense of belonging in these spaces. Thank you, Dean Harris and Dr. Harvey. This has been a particularly in-depth conversation. So there's a quietness, I think, that's happening. I could almost feel our listeners listening, right? There's something that's happening. There's something that's churning. So your words and your lessons and your teaching is very appreciated. I thank you so much. The next Harvey and Harris webinar is December 16th from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock Eastern. And the topic is white rage. So put your registration in now for December 16th for the next conversation. The Wabash Center website will also be, the Wabash Center will be the website, will be the place that archives this conversation, both in audio as well as video. To our viewers and to our listeners, consider using these conversations in your faculty meetings and in your classroom settings. These conversations in themselves are teaching resources, so don't overlook them just for yourself, but bring them to your committee meetings, bring them to the conversations. Many thanks to my team, Carly and Paul, who make our digital resources possible. And we are out. What a terrific conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really rich.
Wow.
Really
Wow.
rich. Thank you.
The rapport is excellent. We're going into new depths with our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.